I'm Bruce Karasik, co-founder of the Jewish Republican Alliance. Thank you for joining us. We have a very special and important show today. We are honored to welcome three amazing guests from the Middle East Forum: President and co-founder Daniel Pipes, Chief Operations Officer Gregg Roman, and Director of Policy Analysis, Dr. Michael Rubin. We'll begin our conversation in just a few minutes, but first, the Jewish Republican Alliance stands united with the Middle East Forum in our relentless pursuit to defend and promote American and Israeli interests across the Middle East. We gather to learn today and to honor and recognize the important work of the Middle East Forum, a beacon of intellectual and strategic insight since its inception in 1994 by Daniel Pipes. The esteemed institution has been at the forefront of addressing some of the most pressing challenges in the region, from combating radical Islam to fostering Palestinian acceptance of Israel and containing the threats posed by Iran. The theme of our discussion today, New Axis of Evil, Iran, Qatar, and Turkey, highlights the urgency of our mission. In a world where deterrence remains a central goal, the Middle East Forum scholars have provided unparalleled analysis and recommendations. Their work underscores the critical need for clear, decisive action to counteract the aggression of these states, which defy the principles of peace and security that we hold dear. As we all learn from their insights today, let us reaffirm our commitment to supporting Middle East Forum's endeavors. Our common goal, providing a clear path to victory over those who threaten our values and our way of life. Together, we champion the cause of liberty, security, and prosperity. We must stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. We must ensure the safety and security for America and Israel, and we must continue to promote the Judeo-Christian values upon which our great nation was founded. So thank you all for watching. And now I'd like to introduce to you fellow JRA co-founder, Mitch Silberman. Mitch, take it away.
My wife and I have been Southerners for just about a year and a half now. And I have to share with you that being a Jew in Middle Tennessee so far has been spectacular. I remember our very first Shabbat dinner at Chabad of Nashville. We were sitting with a couple that had the thickest Southern accent, and I was just staring in amazement. And I said to them, I have to share with you, I'm not used to hearing Jews sound like this. And he said, well, we're Jewish rednecks, y'all. And of course, that was before October 7th. Since then, so much has changed. I wear this tie every day. I bought it in Israel in the mid-'80s. And especially since October 7th, I make sure it's out at all times. A couple of months ago, I was at the gym, and a big hulking guy looks at me. I've never seen him before. And all of a sudden, he stares and starts walking slowly towards me, and he points to my thigh. And he says, I was born in Israel. I'm an American Jew. I will never vote Democrat again. I don't know how any Jew could ever vote Democrat again. God willing, he's not alone in that sentiment. And a few weeks ago, I was talking to a gentleman named Alan. He's in mid to late 70s, nice guy. We're talking politics. He's a fellow conservative. And I said, you know, Alan, I'd like to invite you to one of our JRA meetings that we have in Nashville. We have a thriving chapter now. And all of a sudden he stops and stares at me. And it would seem like an eternity. And I was wondering, what's he thinking? And then he pulls up his hand and gives me a fist bump. And he goes on to tell me how much he loves Israel and how much his church supports Israel. So what I'm realizing is that October 7th is not just a line of demarcation between those who think morally and immorally, but it's also an accentuator of who you already are. So if prior to October 7th, you didn't like Jews, you weren't a fan of Israel, well, the gloves are off, your anti-Semitism is on full display now, which means you're probably on the left. But if prior to October 7th, you are a supporter of Israel and Judaism, now for some reason you have a more steadfast support for Israel and Judaism. So what I've learned is, for some reason, October 7th is not only a line of demarcation between moral and immoral thinking, it's also an accentuator of who you are, and as well as a disinhibitor. And I'm going to leave you with this amazing quote that I read last month from someone named Jake Novak. And it really sums up so much. He says, as I've written here a few times before, I wish anti-Semitism weren't such an accurate litmus test for a person's entire character, because when I say that, it makes me sound so Jewish-centric. But the litmus test works every time. And now I have the distinct pleasure to introduce three fantastic guests. I'm going to introduce them one by one, and then we're going to jump right into it. Daniel Pipes is president and founder of the Middle East Forum and a historian. He's a columnist from the Washington Times. His special interest includes the public role of Islam, Turkey, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the liberal-conservative divide. He recently finished a book titled Israel Victory: How Zionists Win Acceptance and Palestinians Get Liberated. Mr. Pipes has taught Middle Eastern and world history at Harvard University and the University of Chicago, and served on the Policy Planning Council under President Reagan. Gregg Roman functions as the Chief Operations Officer for the Middle East Forum, responsible for day-to-day management, communications, and financial resource development. Mr. Roman previously served as Director of the Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. In 2014, he was named one of the 10 most inspiring global Jewish leaders by the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. He previously served as the political advisor to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel and worked for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. He attended American University in Washington, D.C., and the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, Israel, where he studied national security studies and political communication. And finally, Dr. Michael Rubin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and director of policy analysis at the Middle East Forum. For the past decade, he has also worked as a contract Persian language analyst for the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies Office. A native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Rubin received a BS degree in biology from Yale University in 1994 and a PhD in history from the same institution in 1999. He contributed affidavits to or served on as an expert witness in court cases involving Hezbollah money laundering, Iranian terrorism, internal Iraqi security. He is the author of 6 books, several dozen book chapters, as the author of more than 2,000 opinion essays and articles in U.S. newspapers. Gentlemen, welcome to the JRA.
Welcome.
So I think we're going to begin. I believe we're going to begin with Michael.
Michael, yes.
Yep, and I'll jump right in for about 5 minutes then.
Wonderful.
Bottom line up front, the status quo is not tenable when it comes to Iran. Some people, as Iran appears on the offense, as it appears just a few turns of a screw away from developing a nuclear weapon, say that we really shouldn't worry because Iran isn't suicidal. You know, I too don't believe that Iran is suicidal. But what worries me is not whether or not Iran is suicidal, but rather whether the regime is terminally ill. When Iran has nuclear weapons, it's not going to be the ordinary people who have command, control, and custody of them. Rather, it's going to be the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the most elite, ideologically pure units of that Revolutionary Guard Corps. We've seen that the Iranian government has lost legitimacy in the eyes of its people. There have been any number of protest movements accelerating over the years. If the regime elements, security elements, join in, it's like Romania in 1989 with the regime collapsing. What's to stop the units of the Revolutionary Guard with nuclear weapons from launching, knowing that their regime is over in 24 hours no matter what? That's when deterrence goes out the window, and that's now what we're up against. The only other point I would make before turning the floor over to Gregg is that the status quo isn't tenable for another reason. We're in a period of transition in the Middle East right now. Look at Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority. He's 88 years old and in the 19th year of his 4-year presidential term. There will be transition. Likewise, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, is 85 years old. He's a 2-time cancer survivor. He's partially paralyzed. And even if he was in fantastic health, 85-year-old Ayatollahs tend not to have a long lifespan. The point of this is we're going to be dealing with a transition in Iran, and it's not clear that transition will be smooth. Is the next administration, Democrat or Republican, prepared to try to empower ordinary Iranians who may want to throw off the yoke of the dictatorship upon which they've lived for the past 45 years? Are they prepared to try to marginalize the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which isn't simply a military dictatorship, but rather is ideologically vetted in a manner which self-propels the regime so that the regime doesn't spin out? Could we see a civil war in Iran? Or could we see factional divisions within a council of supreme leadership? I would remind you that when Osama bin Laden was killed, Ayman al-Zawahiri was appointed his deputy, his successor. But then we had a situation in which other claimants to power competed to try to show the most bloodshed, to sponsor the most spectacular terrorist attacks in a way where they could claim leadership. Is that the dynamic which we're entering to with regard to Iran? Now, Russians tell a joke about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The Russian pessimist said, you know, things have never been so bad. War, famine, economy, environment, they couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one who says, no, 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 they can always get worse. And so with that optimistic assessment, let me turn the floor over to Gregg.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for the JRA for hosting the three of us this afternoon. Or if we're in the Pacific Coast, I guess it's just the beginning of your afternoon. The stark reality of the situation is that while most individuals are aware of the pernicious and dangerous and malign behavior of a country like Iran, they are less aware of a smaller peninsular nation in the Persian Gulf, Qatar. Qatar is seen from one point of view, at least from the one American point of view, as an ally of the United States, having been named as a non-NATO major ally by the Biden administration a few years ago. There's an annual strategic dialogue between the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and other U.S. national security agencies, and the Qatari counterparts. Qatar invests tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in the U.S. economy. It has technology sharing agreements. 6 major American universities have campuses in Doha, in their education city. And we even have the U.S.'s Central Command Major Air Base, Al Udeid, which sits on Qatari territory. But another story involving Qatar and its support for terror organizations really underscores the stark reality of the relationship between the United States and this Gulf Emirate. 31 Americans died on October 7th in the Hamas Tufan al-Aqsa, or Al-Aqsa flood operation, which saw the deaths of over 1,000 Israelis and the subsequent Israel-Hamas war, which has now been going on for the last 4, almost 5 months. Actually, we're pretty close getting to the half-year mark in a few weeks. But what has not been spoken about was the fact that 31 of these individuals were American citizens that were killed in those attacks, and American citizens are even being held hostage right now in Gaza, while over 1/10 of Israeli casualties in the subsequent war, which took place after October 7th, were dual Israeli-U.S. nationals. Hamas was seen celebrating these attacks with its leadership in Doha, Salah al-Arori, the head of its operations division, Ismail Haniyeh, the overall head of the organization, and other Hamas officials were filmed on Al Jazeera, which is Qatari state television, preparing for their afternoon prayers while at the same time looking at a TV screen as Hamas terrorists came across the border. Qatar financially supports Hamas, somewhat in the past at the invitation of the Israeli government in order to have a process of what they consider to be de-escalation, where Qatari money went into Gaza to pay Hamas salaries and pay for aid projects in the Gaza Strip. But at the same time, that money, we now have learned, was diverted to building Hamas terrorist infrastructure. As I said before, and Qatar harbors Hamas leaders, allowing their top terrorists to operate out of Doha, the country's capital city. And Qatar's media arm promotes Hamas propaganda, showing frequent positive coverage on Al Jazeera and other Qatari state outlets. But this is not the only singular instance of Qatar sponsoring organizations or giving financial or material support to terror organizations, which are on the U.S. Department of Treasury and State Department's special designated terrorist lists. They have provided harbor to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the architect of the 9/11 attacks. They have allowed ISIS to raise funds in Qatar and Doha and spread their propaganda beyond its borders. They have given support to the Muslim Brotherhood by allowing the former head of the organization to live in Doha, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and have also provided a main hub of operations for the Taliban prior to the US withdrawal. These 5 organizations, in addition to dozens more, are just the silver lining of Qatar's support for terrorism in terms of what we actually know about, because Qatar's behavior is much, much more malign rather than just its open support for these organizations. They engage in soft power campaigns throughout the United States, buying up tens of thousands of acres in American agricultural land. They invest in American sports teams like Washington, D.C. basketball and hockey teams. They give billions of dollars to underwrite loans to corporations which are connected to America's top politicians. They even have an arms export division, Barzan Aeronautical, that sits in Charleston, South Carolina, using America's best engineers of unmanned aerial vehicles, then exporting that technology to Delaware, Germany, and then to Barzan Aeronautical's headquarters in Doha, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Qatari Ministry of Defense. They use world sporting events like the World Cup and the World Track Championships, the World Handball Championships, some sports which Americans may not watch, to try to garner global favor. And they all do this as part of what I call the old Qatari two-step, the effort to support terror organizations while at the same time trying to act as an indispensable ally of Western countries in the Middle East. But this all does not come without a cost to American interests. And the Qataris were almost held accountable back in 2017 when the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council was able to put a blockade on the country. But by the end of the Trump administration, that blockade was lifted for reasons unbeknownst to most individuals who were outside of the conversations between top Qatari officials, the State Department, and other Gulf countries. But seemingly because the Qataris knew that a new administration was coming into power, and the Trump administration itself had gotten to the point where it didn't want to have any bickering between its erstwhile Gulf allies. Now, what can be done about this? We can talk about this a little bit later, but 4 things have to be focused on. Number 1, Qatari lobbying in the United States has to be called out. If you're an American politician, whether it be Republican or Democrat, and you have relations with the Qataris, you have to be held to account for that. 2, Qatar has to be ejected from the American college campus. It has to not be allowed to have these significant college campuses in Doha, and those college campuses and those college administrations that receive federal funding should be investigated for their Qatari connections. Qatar's media investments in the United States also have to be looked at. Al Jazeera right now operates on Capitol Hill with over 100 press passes from the U.S. House and Senate press galleries. Those should be revoked. A Hamas propagandist should not be able to operate in the heart of American democracy. And lastly, Qatar's leaders and their assets have to be held to account. There will be a series of what I envision will be civil actions brought by American victims of Hamas and Qatari-funded terrorism, and the Qatari assets which are currently in the United States, and even those that are beyond the reach of the U.S. financial system, should be on alert. Because I can guarantee you, attorneys representing the victims of Hamas terrorism will be coming for them. And lastly, before we transition over to Iran, Qatar has to be removed as a cancer from the U.S.'s defense strategy in the Middle East. Only when the U.S. is able to pivot to a non-Qatar connected defense regimen will they be able to truly be free of Qatar's grasp. How such a small country can have so much power over the world superpower is dumbfounding to me. But now it's time for Qatar to be held to account. Daniel?
Thanks, Greg. Well, if Iran is obviously an enemy and Qatar is not so obviously an enemy, Turkey appears to be a friend. Turkey is a former ally, a NATO ally. Something happens to Turkey, then we have to go to its defense, and vice versa. But in fact, Turkey is no longer an ally, and this is my basic point. Americans need to reassess, re-understand this country. It's not the good old days. U.S. policy towards Turkey was simple in a half century from 1952, from Korea War to 2002. Basically, the United States led and the Turks followed. There were tensions from time to time, for example, 1964 over Cyprus, But basically, this was as good as it could get from the American point of view. Just this important country that followed us. But corruption and incompetence brought down the secular leadership that had been in charge for many decades. And instead, in 2002, Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power in an astonishing election where basically there were just two parties out of the usual 8 or so that came into parliament, and he had essentially total control. And since early 2003, Erdogan has been for 21 years in control, ever more in control. Initially, the steps away from the United States were tentative and cautious, and Americans tended to be blind to this, and they continued with business as usual. George W. Bush helped Erdogan become prime minister. Obama called Erdogan one of his 5 best foreign friends. Trump essentially invited a Turkish invasion of Syria, and Biden is rewarding bad behavior. Well, I'm thinking of Sweden. The DOD believes the good old days can come back. We just have to wait out Erdogan. Things will turn out okay. The State Department appeases. They all ignore that Turkey is a changed place. In the course of these 2 decades, it is a changed place. It is a dictatorship. Yeah, there are elections, but there are also elections in a few days in Russia. Elections don't mean a whole lot. It's a dictatorship. Erdogan has consolidated power over Turkey's institutions, the military, the intelligence services, the police, the judiciary, the banks, the media, the election boards, the mosques, and the educational system, plus more. He has a private security service called Sadat, which is kind of an army of his own. Academics or others who sign protests are accused of terrorism and thrown into jail. As his popularity has waned, which it has done in the last 7-8 years, the shenanigans over elections have increased. Election abuses, dominating media coverage, having goons attack rival parties' offices, and so forth has increased. Islamism is part of the package. Erdogan rose as a Muslim extremist. He engages in the usual rogue practices of an Islamist. He's a more clever Islamist. Iran, they're not so clever. They're obvious, they're blatant, they're aggressive and violent. Erdogan is much more measured and has done a better job. But he abducts dissident Turkish citizens. He drills in Cypriot exclusive economic zone, and he invades his neighbor Syria. He's anti-women. The rate of feminine, I can't say that word, murder of women has gone up about 14 times since the beginning of his reign. He's opposed to payment of interest. So he long insisted that interest rates need to be high in order to deal with high inflation. And this means that the Turkish lira, the Turkish currency, has lost about 95% of its value, going from 45 cents 10 years ago today to 3 cents today. He buys arms and more from China and Russia. In fact, just today, there is news of his buying a second nuclear power station from Russia. Of course, Turks have become anti-American. When he came to power, more than half of Turks were pro-American, now maybe a sixth, and keeps on going down. Anti-Americanism is rampant in politics, media, movies, school textbooks, and so forth. What's even worse is that the nationalists and the leftists are yet more anti-American than the Islamists. So it's become a highly unfriendly country. Hostility is now mutual. For example, for decades, the US Congress held off recognizing the Armenian genocide, but in 2019, it passed it by a whopping 405 to 11. In conclusion, there's no way that Turkey will return to the friendly relations that existed before 2003 until there is a fundamental change in government, like in Iran. Not so dramatic, but it's somewhat similar. We need, in the meantime, to accept that Ankara is hostile without delusions. This requires a big change in attitude. Turkey is not our friend, is not our ally. It is a rogue state that is hostile. Thanks.
Thank you all for that marvelous introduction and details Now we're going to move to the question and answer discussion part of our show. I want to start with Michael. Couple of part question. Under the Trump administration, Iran was kind of set into a box, isolated, broke. They seem to be reinvigorated under the current administration. My number one concern is, and maybe you can address this, is how do we stop them from getting a nuclear weapon? What is it going to take to stop it? We keep reading that they're close, they're close. How do we stop that? And how do we resist and stop their proxy wars with the countries that they're using to attack American and Israeli interests?
That's a great question. First of all, I think that Daniel, Greg, and I are on the same page, that the United States shouldn't snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. If the Iranian people want to rise up and change the regime, we should do nothing to stand in their way. Rather, when it comes to environmentalists, when it comes to labor unions, and so forth in Iran, we might even consider how we can assist them. For example, with labor unions and strike funds. Why is it that European Green parties support the environment the world over, except in the Islamic Republic of Iran, even as Iranians protest the environment? The Iranians tend to be scared to death of these issue-oriented movements because they span ethnicity, they span religion, and they span social class. With regard to the nuclear program, there can be no fundamental change in Iran until we fracture the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. One question is how we do that. When it comes to intelligence, we talk about what we know. Almost everyone in the audience has probably heard people talk about hardliners and reformers among Iranian politicians. But what are the factional divisions within the Revolutionary Guard? After all, the Revolutionary Guard isn't simply an army. It's charged with defense of the revolution, which means its enemies can as much be internal to Iran as external. I would argue when it comes to the so-called axis of resistance, Iranian support for Hezbollah, for Hamas, for the Houthis, and for myriad other groups, we've got to start picturing this like an octopus. We can conduct war with the tentacles and ignore the head of the octopus. But ultimately, we've got to address the fact that the command and control is coming from inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. In my opinion, that doesn't mean bombing Iran, because that would rally Iranians around the flag. But if you have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps outside the country, they shouldn't get a get-out-of-jail-free card. So, in short, there is certainly a lot we can do in order to put Iran in the box. One last final comment. Maximum pressure worked. When Iran, let me put it this way. In 1982, Iranians considered ending the Iran-Iraq War. They had mostly pushed Saddam Hussein's armies out. But the Revolutionary Guard came to Khomeini, the leader of the Islamic Revolution, and said, no, we need to continue until we get rid of Saddam Hussein and until we liberate Jerusalem. There followed 6 more years of war, and 500,000 more people died. Finally, it was too much, and Khomeini got on the radio, and I'm quoting. He said, it's like drinking from a chalice of poison, but I have no choice but to drink from this cup if the revolution is to survive. The point of this is maximum pressure works, that it causes Iran to change its fundamental commitments to its policies, but it can't simply be geared to the lifespan of a US administration. I spent time during COVID in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. And Hezbollah members, some of whom had been prisoners of war inside Israel, were complaining to me, an American Jew, that they felt abandoned, that their money had dried up, that they had no more interest in Hezbollah because Hezbollah wasn't paying their salaries. We need to restore maximum pressure. And for those who are in it for the money, dry up the money. And for those who are in it for the ideology, we have to kill them. But that is, I mean, part of a coherent strategy, and it's realism. But with that, let me turn the floor back to you and to my colleagues.
I just have just a quick follow from there. So if we knew that the Iranians were very, very close to getting a nuclear weapon, do you support attacking whatever infrastructure they have to make sure they don't get that? Because once they get it, it's game over.
Okay, here's my problem. If you attack Iran to delay a nuclear program, you will affect the delay at significant cost. My question to future policymakers, and I believe that the conversation is much more realistic among the Republican camp than the Democrat camp right now, is what are we going to do to take advantage of that delay to ultimately resolve the problem, which is the nature of the Iranian regime, rather than simply the nuclear weapons themselves. If we're simply using American jets and pilots to kick the can down the road, that comes at tremendous cost in blood and treasure. And it would be irresponsible to do that if we don't have the second aspect, which ultimately is ending this regime.
Terrific. I want to acknowledge all three of you with such profound insights on each of these countries. Greg, you said something which really caught my attention, that we know Iran's the bad guy, but we don't, how come the American people don't know about Qatar or Qatar? I'm not sure. I guess you would know how to pronounce it. I've never got that straight. But my question to you is, while U.S. citizens may not be aware, I'm hoping our military is keenly aware. And then the question is, why do we even allow or even support Qatar with what you shared with us?
There is sort of a, I don't want to call it Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but there's members of the U.S. defense community that are drinking the Qatari KoolAid, or KoolAid with a Q. And what I mean by that is that they see Qatar as a partner that they can use as sort of a hedge against other worst U.S. enemies in that area of the world. They know that the Qataris are going to do a few things that benefit the U.S. defense community. The first thing is they're going to pay for Al Udeid Air Force Base and its upkeep. When the U.S. was considering moving out of it in 2017, 2018, a plan was announced a few months after that news story came out about the enlargement of the airbase at Qatari expense. The second thing is that Qatar does provide intelligence to the United States intelligence community, not always necessarily a full blanket or scan of what's going on in the region, but it does provide selective intelligence stemming against immediate U.S. threats. Also, on the diplomatic front, Qatar enables the U.S. to deal with bad actors in the region that it otherwise wouldn't want to have direct relations with. Look at what's going on right now with the negotiation for the release of hostages from Hamas captivity. The Qataris are the middlemen. The same thing happened with the Taliban. From the release of Bo Bergdahl from Taliban captivity back in the mid-teens, all the way through the agreement that was called the Doha Agreement, which was allowing the U.S. to have an orderly withdrawal from Afghanistan. And now, if you want to get a U.S. passport in Kabul, you have to go to the Qatari embassy in order to do so. They represent American interests in Afghanistan as of this point. But all of that comes at a significant cost. You have the Qataris who are embedded in U.S. K-12 education. Most of the Arabic language education that takes place in elementary, middle, and high schools is paid for by the Qatar Foundation. If you look at the premier centers of American academia across different sectors of higher education, medicine is at Cornell, diplomacy is at Georgetown, computer science is at Carnegie Mellon, business is at Northwestern, science is at Texas A&M. These are the campuses that are in Doha. They have selected the best of the best, the creme de la creme of American academia, and they have invested billions of dollars in these institutions to have a firm grasp on America's future elite. And even if you look at politics, there's not an insignificant reason why Qatar has its defense operations centered in South Carolina. And I know that this is a Republican-friendly call, but there are U.S. senators that are abiding by Qatar's diktats in the U.S. Senate and preventing any major accountability coming to raise these issues to the national stage. And some of them happen to be in the Republican Party. Also, many others happen to be in the Democratic Party. You know, Qatar money doesn't have any partisan affiliation. But they have done a very good job at playing the American influence game, and they have to be ejected as soon as possible.
Thank you. I have a question for Daniel. I know you have written a book called Israel Victory, How Zionists Win Acceptance and Palestinians Get Liberated.
Yep.
My concern, and I've objected to the idea of a Palestinian state on the basis that you do not reward a people or a government for committing so many years of terrorism, vowing to kill Israelis. But I know that your expertise revolves around solving that situation. And I'd love to hear your comments on how to solve that Palestinian Arab, the Israeli-Arab conflict, especially now since the Abraham Accords have been put on hold. Where do we go from here?
I wouldn't say the Abraham Accords have been put on hold. They're quietly functioning in the background. On the Palestinian state, George W. Bush endorsed it in 2002 for the U.S. government. That hasn't changed. And Benjamin Netanyahu endorsed it in 2009 for the Israeli government, and that hasn't changed. It's a done thing. Both of the key countries have endorsed it. So that's that. Now, both of them had conditions. None of those conditions have been fulfilled. So I'm okay in principle with a Palestinian state so long as those conditions are fulfilled, so long as the Palestinians have come to accept Israel as the Jewish state. Once they do that, yeah, okay, it's a possibility. But until that happens, and that's a very distant prospect, there is no possibility of a Palestinian state. So I don't argue against it in principle. I argue against it in say that at present it's an absurdity. How can you reward, as you pointed out, people who are genocidal, who want to destroy their enemy? How can you give them a state? No, it's an absurdity at present, but at some point, in theory, it could be a practical solution.
Michael, you said something very ominous to me, which was something to the effect of what might the Iranian regime do as its last move before it's ousted rather. And I don't know how you phrased it, but it really caught my attention. They're not a democracy, but what you're saying is if they have these genocidal intentions and they realize they're on the way out, they may not go peacefully. They may say, who are we taking down with us? I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, you accurately reflected what I was getting at, which is this notion that Iran isn't suicidal, meaning deterrence can work, is somehow an excuse for inaction when it comes to our failure to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Deterrence is not only a military strategy, it's a psychological strategy as well. I should note that during the 2007 Democratic CNN YouTube debate, a question was asked to then Senator Biden, Obama, and Clinton about what would happen if Iran used nuclear weapons. And Senator Clinton at the time said something to the effect of, we would obliterate Iran. And Biden agreed with her, but Obama did not. And Obama chided his Senate colleagues for the rhetoric and for the implication of what might happen. And in doing so, he undermined the psychological notion that is the base of deterrence. This is what is so dangerous right now. Separately, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, had once said, don't worry, to our Gulf allies, and I don't include Qatar in that, although she did, but don't worry, because if Iran develops nuclear weapons, we will establish a nuclear umbrella over you to ensure that you have deterrence. The problem with this is all the Gulf allies said, wait, You've been telling us for years you will never allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Now you're suggesting that's a possibility. How can we ever trust your word again, you being the United States? Unfortunately, this hemorrhaging of credibility is where we are now at. And I would argue restoring American credibility should be high on the priority for any new administration, simply because if we're getting challenged, for example, by the Houthis, a ragtag group from the mountains of northern Yemen, then ultimately we can get challenged from anywhere, because this notion that the United States has deterrence has simply evaporated over the last several years.
Thank you. Gregg, I want to go to you now, and I have a question about Qatar. I'm trying to, you raised so many interesting facts that I did not know. Understanding that we use their naval bases, understanding that
They're Air Force bases.
Air Force bases, sorry. Understanding that they are investing in the United States. Why do they support our enemies? Why are they harboring Hamas? Why are they playing both sides of the fence? And why wouldn't, if they have such a tremendous investment in the United States, why are they still working behind the scenes against our interests?
There's a joke that Daniel told me, so I'm going to be saying this secondhand. He might be better apt at saying this joke, but there was a conversation that took place between the Secretary of State in 1992, 1993, right at the end of the Cold War. And he was told, he was being asked the question in the State Department's 8th floor lobby, where a lot of the staffers get together, and was being asked, so now that the Soviet Union is gone, who are the two most powerful countries in the world? And the answer that he gave was, well, of course, the United States and Qatar. And the reason that he asked and answered that way is because the Qataris have sort of a Napoleon complex. And this goes all the way back to the country's founding, after it was invited to be the last emirate as part of the United Arab Emirates when the UAE got independence, and it said, no, we're okay, we'll go our own way. And since then, it has sort of been the odd man out of Gulf politics. It adopted the Muslim Brotherhood line of political thought rather than going with the other Wahhabist strain and some of the other areas in which the Gulfs were developing in terms of their religious polities. It was also in the Gulf War, part of the Arab Legion or the Arab Brigade. And I think Michael has a better history of this than I do, but I'll try to do it justice, which is when there was the three main fronts where Norman Schwarzkopf was ordering the invasion of Iraq from Saudi Arabia and also into Kuwait. There was the Qatari brigade and there was the Saudi brigade. And the Qatari brigade opened fire on the Saudis to be able to get a head start into Iraq, to be able to claim to be the first Gulf Arab country to sort of take back Iraq and Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. And this mental placement goes all the way through 2024. They always have to be at the edge of being the best Arab country in the Gulf. And to do that, they have to play both sides. They have the largest American air base in the Middle East, but they also have the largest renminbi and yuan exchange for the Chinese in the Middle East. They are at the forefront of trying to sell liquefied natural gas to American consumers, while at the same time acting as a buffer for Russian and Iranian sanctions, which are coming through the Pars field. They are hosting all these terror organizations in Doha, while at the same time having America's best universities there. They are trying to play the ultimate middleman game to be able to play both sides off of each other. So no matter which way the global political wind blows, they're going to be on the right side. And that's more of an analysis than maybe a factual pattern. But I see them as always trying to have their hand in the pot, irregardless of how many pots there are to be able to tap. So that's sort of where they come from. And even the familiar, the psychology of the Tamim family. You know, there's been a coup or two in Qatar over the past 40 or 43 years. Now 53 years. And you always see that the family that's in charge, that's always trying to be at the forefront of Qatari politics, is the one that is the most cunning. And they apply that strategy both domestically and internationally.
So is American leadership afraid to confront Qatar because of the financial interests, the military interests, and for fear of losing them as even a partial ally?
I think instead of Qatar being America's useful idiot, the US is Qatar's useful idiot. And we just don't see them necessarily as a threat. And until a public campaign is able to educate Americans about the threat that they actually pose to American democracy and, more importantly, American interests in the Middle East, I don't think American leadership is going to act on that.
Thank
Could
you.
I just jump in for a second?
Sure.
I hugely agree with Greg. I would just say, as someone who's sitting right outside of Washington, D.C. right now, the U.S. government and the bureaucracies within the U.S. government are very adept at not being able to see the forest through the trees. So when we talk about Al Udeid Air Base, let's put aside the fact that we had 4 times more aircraft stationed at Sheikh Issa Air Base during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. It's not essential. But as Greg said, many American servicemen like the type of life which they have in Qatar, with all the luxury franchises and so forth. Many of our rogue regimes or frenemies have understood that these military bases can be get out of jail free cards on accountability. So Qatar plays this to a T with Al Udeid Air Base. Turkey does the same thing with the Incirlik Air Base. And the Pentagon, unfortunately, doesn't look at the broader US national security implications. They just look at their balance sheet and say, hey, look, a free base. Why would we ever want to risk this? And unfortunately, what we need is leadership at the very top in the White House, at the National Security Council, in order to try to force our bureaucracies to see the bigger picture. Short of that, I rest easier knowing that Daniel Pipes and Gregg Roman are on the case because they are heard across Washington.
Well, Michael, you said we need strong leadership in the White House. In my biased opinion, it ain't happening under this regime. So November can't come soon enough. We have some really great questions in the audience. I'm going to aim this one at Daniel, then maybe Michael, you can chime in. This is from David R. And he says, Israel, and specifically Bibi, has hinted at supporting the Iranian people who seek to overthrow the Ayatollah with air and even sea support, should they engage in an uprising. So, Daniel, we'll start with you. What's your opinion on that as Israeli policy?
I think it's fantasy. The Israelis do not have that kind of power projection, as was seen with the Kurds a number of times in Iraq, which is not as far away as Iran. No, the United States can do that. Israel can't. They can help in some clandestine ways, but they can't really support a movement against the regime.
And Michael, did you want to chime in on that?
I would just chime in very quickly. Iranians are nationalistic. They don't want the fingerprints of foreign powers on their uprisings, but rest assured, they themselves are primed to do this. Sorry, very quickly, there's an Iranian joke about an Iranian woman who's getting married. And on her wedding night, she tells her husband, I probably should have done this before. I probably should have told you this before, but this is my second marriage. And the husband goes, what? And she says, no, don't worry. I'm still a virgin. And the husband says, well, how can that be? She said, well, my first husband was like Hassan Rouhani, the former president. He kept promising to do it, promising to do it, promising to do it. And after 8 years, he didn't touch a thing. The Iranian public, even those who are primed for so-called trickle-down reform, have basically lost any faith in this sort of regime. Our best policy would be to step aside and not get in the way of the Iranians as they do what's necessary to end their regime.
I want to bring up October 7th. I have 2 questions, and any of you or all of you can chime in on this. One, how could this have happened? Why did security not pick this up? Why did intelligence not pick it up? And where is this going to end? How does this end?
I'll maybe, Daniel, if you're okay with it, answer the first part, and then maybe you and Michael can answer the second. Okay. Bruce, I just got back from a week-long trip to Israel, and I see some of the participants are here as part of your audience, so they can correct me if I make any mistakes on sort of the experiences that we were able to view and some of the explanations we got from the members of the IDF and the Israeli national security community. October 7th, the actual plan of attack was known to the Israeli defense establishment at least 2 years prior to it taking place. They had the Tufan al-Aqsa plans in their hands, but as part of what was called a intelligence community red team, or a team within Israel's Ministry of Defense, which was responsible for coming up with ideas of how the enemy may attack, it was considered to be something which was not at all likely, because the thought that the Israeli national security establishment had was that Hamas was having the good life in Gaza. It had not participated in a round of Islamic Jihad rocket strikes in 2022. Its last major conflict was in May of 2021. And 2+ years of conflict showed that Hamas, at least to Israelis, was not interested in escalating rocket fire or carrying out any major attacks. That groupthink that became enmeshed in the Israeli National Security Council and in the Prime Minister's office, both under Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, and then under Benjamin Netanyahu, became the order of the day. And when a phone call came in to Herzl Halevi, the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, at 4:30 in the morning, and there was an intelligence assessment about unusual activity at the border, they said, well, maybe this is just another Hamas movement. It's not something that we have to take seriously. Let's speak about it again at 8:30 a.m. And by that time, Hamas forces had already breached the border fence in 43 different areas. They used drones to take out observation towers. They used advanced munitions to take out the fence. They were able to disrupt the entire cellular network, and they knew every single inch of Israeli territory within a 20-kilometer radius of Gaza, due to the fact that they had double agents on the ground under the guise of Palestinian laborers with Israeli work permits. So on the tactical side, Israel was surprised. Its intelligence and operational forces were surprised. And at the same time, there was only 600 Israeli troops that were guarding the border that day, of whom 300 were asleep because of shifts. So Israel was caught. And what I've argued in the past was its greatest military intelligence and operational failure in the country's history. In terms of where we go from here, I'll maybe let Daniel and Michael address that.
Well, it's pretty unclear where we go from here. It's very much a war in progress. Though I would argue that the U.S. and Israeli position should be not resettling Gaza with Jewish Israelis, not bringing in the Palestinian Authority, not bringing in the Egyptians or other Arab states, but rather to have the Israelis work directly with Gazans who are not necessarily friendly to Israel, but who are unfriendly to Hamas, people who have despaired of life under Hamas for the past 17 years and who are ready, willing to work with Israel to start something different. I think this is a very different time from, say, 1967, when the Israelis took large swaths of land and populations, and they were innocent. Now they're not innocent anymore, and I think they have the means, and I hope they have the will to affect something like that, which would be good for Gazans and good for Israelis.
Bruce, if I could just add on to that for a second. There's a great piece which is in Middle East Quarterly, our quarterly publication that just came out a few days ago, about building a decent Gaza, which would ostensibly not threaten Israel in the future. I've shared that link with your moderator, and hopefully you can share that with the panel attendees today. It was written by Daniel Pipes, and he has a smaller piece in the Wall Street Journal that came out over the weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have time for one more audience question. This one's fascinating, and I've learned over the years that what some have called conspiracy theory turns into conspiracy fact. So this question, Michael, I'm going to direct it towards you, is from Drew H. He said, do you think Russia had any influence whatsoever on Iran to have Hamas invade Israel, to take over the world hatred, knowing how the intensity of how the world would react? Because Russia seems to have become a non-topic since October 8th. I know it sounds conspiracy, but it's a fascinating question.
The short answer is no, I don't think so. I think Russia has been perfectly happy to put this out there so that they can feel relevant. if I may just add one thing, as an Iran analyst, what I worry about is we talk about Iran's military, the Revolutionary Guard, the Quds Force, missiles, drones. What we forget is Iran's Air Force. If you saw Top Gun Maverick, you know that Iran is the last country in the world to fly F-14s because they bought them right before the Islamic Revolution, and then they haven't been able to get replacement parts or spare parts. When I read the Iranian press, they've got an aircraft that crashes every 3 months or so, and when you're down to less than 30 aircraft, that matters. What I worry about now is not simply the Iranian drone trade to Russia, but whether Russia might repay the favor by providing Iran with Sukhoi 35s or other advanced jets in a way that can change the operational environment in the region. So I'm taking your question. The answer to your question, I think personally, is no. But the Iran-Russia relationship remains crucial to understand and is developing in other ways.
Thank you. And one final question. We as the Jewish Republican Alliance truly admire all three of you, and we admire the work that you're doing. How can we as our organization work closely with you and you work with us? So, because we're working toward the same goals, we want to support you. How can organizations like ours help you?
So there's three or four things that your viewers could do. The first thing that you can do is you can go to meforum.org/donate and contribute to the organization. I mean, it's a straightforward request, but we can't do our work without paying our researchers, our activists, and the people on the ground that we gather information from. So please support the Middle East Forum. But beyond financial support, we also ask you to become readers by going to meforum.org. You'll see a email button in the upper right-hand corner and sign up for our mailing list across our different projects. The third thing that you can do is take part in MEF campaigns, whether it's trying to stop Islamist organizations like CARE from gathering at public facilities or supporting our legislative agenda. Our director for MEF Action, Ben Baird, has campaigns like the U.S. campaign to defeat Hamas or the campaign to get CARE blacklisted from public facilities. And this is something that I encourage you to do. And most importantly, beyond those three things of donating, of reading, and of acting, you can tell your friends about the work that we do. You can share our website on social media. We have an active Twitter account that's been shared with you, an active website, an active Facebook account, and spread the message as far and as wide as possible. By only educating other Americans about the work that we're doing, I think we really can have a true impact.
Thank you very, very much.
Well said.
It's very well said. You know, we encourage our audience and our organization to support the Middle East Forum. They do great work. It's been an honor and a privilege to have all of you on today, and thank you from Mitch and I and our whole organization for your insight and for being on our show today.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. We appreciate your support. Support the Middle East Forum. If you like these type of shows, you can suggest other groups and organizations to have on, attend our events, get involved, stay informed, make a difference. If you want to donate to the Jewish Republican Alliance, go to jewishrepublicanalliance.org.org. Thank you all for being there. Until we meet again, thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.